The sterile smell of lemon disinfectant and floor wax hung heavy in the air of Heritage Hall, a scent that Eleanor Vance had come to despise over the last 6 months. It was the smell of sickness trying to hide behind cleanliness. Eleanor sat in the high-backed vinyl chair beside her father's bed, her hands clasped tight in her lap. The rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the cardiac monitor was the only sound in the dim room, marking the seconds of a life that seemed to be slipping away faster than the doctors could explain. Her father, Arthur, a retired carpenter who had once built half the houses in this county with his own 2 hands, now looked incredibly small beneath the thin hospital sheets. His skin was a waxy shade of gray, and his breathing was shallow, rattling in his chest like dry leaves. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. She reached out to brush a stray lock of white hair from his forehead. "He was fine 2 weeks ago. He was walking the garden. He was laughing." Beside her, resting his heavy head on the edge of the bed mattress, was Barnaby. Barnaby was a golden retriever with a coat the color of deep honey and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 years of soulfulness. He wasn't just a pet, he was Arthur's shadow. For 10 years they had been inseparable. When Arthur moved into Heritage Hall's new luxury care wing, the only condition was that Barnaby could come too. Usually, Barnaby was a calm, stoic presence. He would sleep at Arthur's feet for hours, offering the silent, warm comfort. But tonight, Barnaby was different. For the past hour, the dog hadn't slept. He had been pacing the small length of the room, his nails clicking softly on the new laminate flooring. Every few minutes, he would stop and stare intently at the wall behind Arthur's headboard, a freshly painted wall in a soothing shade of sage green. Barnaby let out a low, vibrating whine, a sound so mournful it made Eleanor's chest ache. "Shh, Barnaby," Eleanor soothed, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "It's okay, boy. I know you're worried about him. I am too." The dog leaned into her touch for a brief second, seeking reassurance, but then he pulled away. He walked back to the wall, sniffed deeply at the electrical outlet near the floor, and then looked back at Eleanor with an intensity that unsettled her. He didn't look sad. He looked alert. The door to the room swung open with a soft hydraulic hiss. Dr. Lawrence Thorne strode in, his white coat crisp and his smile practiced. He was the new medical director of Heritage Hall, a man who spoke more about efficiency ratings and donor satisfaction than he did about patient care. "Good evening, Ms. Vance," Dr. Thorne said, his voice smooth but lacking genuine warmth. He picked up Arthur's chart from the end of the bed, flipping through the pages with a dismissive speed. "I see Arthur is having another difficult night. His oxygen levels are fluctuating again." "It's not just a fluctuation, Doctor," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's getting worse. Every time he spends a night in this room, he wakes up weaker. His headaches, the nausea, the confusion, it all started when you moved him to this new wing." Dr. Thorne sighed, a sound that bordered on patronizing. He closed the chart and clasped his hands behind his back. "Eleanor, we have discussed this. Your father is 82 years old. What you are witnessing is the natural, albeit rapid, progression of his condition. This new wing is state-of-the-art. It has the best ventilation, the best lighting, the most advanced monitoring systems in the state." "But he was healthy in the old wing," Eleanor insisted. "He was strong." "He was younger in the old wing," Thorne countered coldly. His eyes drifted down to Barnaby, who was now standing between the doctor and the bed, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. Thorne took a step back, his lip curling in distaste. "And frankly, Ms. Vance, I am beginning to question the wisdom of allowing a large animal in a critical care environment. It is unsanitary. Look at him. He's agitated. He's shedding. Animals carry dander, bacteria, allergens that could be complicating your father's respiratory issues. Barnaby is a certified therapy dog, Eleanor defended, standing up. He is cleaner than most of this hospital, and he's the only thing keeping my father fighting. Barnaby didn't back down. He took a step toward the pristine, sage-green wall again and barked a sharp, demanding sound that echoed loudly in the small room. He pawed at the drywall, his claws leaving faint white scratches on the perfect paint. "That is enough," Dr. Thorne snapped, his patience evaporating. "The dog is destructive and aggressive. We have the regional board visiting tomorrow for the grand opening ceremony of this wing. I cannot have an uncontrollable animal damaging the facility and disturbing other patients." He pointed a manicured finger at the door. "I am afraid I have to insist, Ms. Vance. You need to take the dog home. Tonight." Eleanor felt a surge of panic. "You can't do that. It's in his contract. If Barnaby leaves, my father will give up. You know that." "My priority is your father's medical stability, not his sentimental attachments," Thorne said, checking his watch. "Please remove the animal within the hour, or I will have security do it for you. We need this room sterile." Dr. Thorne turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving a silence that felt heavier than before. Eleanor looked down at her dying father, and then at the dog who was now pressing his nose frantically against the baseboard of the wall, whining as if trying to tell her a secret that human language couldn't carry. Barnaby wasn't acting out of aggression. Eleanor had known this dog since he was a puppy. She knew every mood, every signal. This wasn't anger. This was a warning. She knelt down beside him. The air near the floor felt different, heavier somehow. And as she leaned close to where Barnaby was scratching, she smelled it. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the overwhelming scent of lemon disinfectant. A sweet, cloying smell, like almonds rotting in the sun. "What do you smell, Barnaby?" she whispered, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. The dog looked at her, then looked back at the wall, and let out a single, sharp bark. He wasn't trying to destroy the room. He was trying to show her what was hiding behind the paint. The hour that Dr. Thorne had given Eleanor hung over the room like a storm cloud. Eleanor didn't pack. She didn't call a taxi. Instead, she sat on the cold floor beside the electrical outlet, her nose inches from the drywall. Barnaby sat beside her, his body rigid as a statue. He wasn't whining anymore. He was waiting. He seemed to understand that his warning had finally been heard, and now he watched Eleanor with an intense, silent expectation. "It smells sweet," Eleanor murmured, closing her eyes and inhaling deeply near the plastic socket cover. "Sickly sweet, like old glue and bitter fruit." She opened her eyes and looked at her father. Arthur's chest rose and fell in a jagged rhythm. The skin around his mouth was tinged with blue, a sign of hypoxia that the doctors kept blaming on his age, on his heart, on everything except the room he was sleeping in. A memory surfaced in Eleanor's mind. She was 10 years old, standing in a half-built house with her father. He was holding a piece of damp drywall, crumbing it in his large, calloused hands. "You see this, Ellie?" he had told her, his voice deep and rumbling. "Some folks try to paint over the rot. They think if it looks pretty, it's safe. But a house has lungs, just like us. If the walls can't breathe, the people inside suffocate. A house has lungs." The door clicked open again. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, instinctively stepping in front of Barnaby to shield him. But it wasn't Dr. Thorne. It was Sarah, the night shift nurse. She was young, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. She held a tray of medications, but her hands were shaking slightly as she set it down on the rolling table. "I heard him," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the open door before pushing it until it clicked shut. "Dr. Thorne, he can be very loud." "He wants to kick us out," Eleanor said, her voice hard. "He thinks Barnaby is the problem." Sarah looked at the dog. Barnaby didn't growl at her. He trotted over and nudged her hand gently with his wet nose. Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping as she scratched his head. "He's the best visitor we have," Sarah said softly. "He sits with Mrs. Gable in room 304 when her family doesn't show up. He knows when the patients are scared." "He's scared now," Eleanor said. She pointed to the wall behind the bed. "Sarah, tell me the truth. You're here every night. Have you noticed anything odd about this wing? About the air?" Sarah froze. She looked at the sage-green wall, then back at Eleanor. She chewed on her lower lip, a look of genuine fear crossing her face. "I'm not supposed to talk about facility operations," she recited, sounding like she was reading from a script. But then she stopped. She looked at Arthur's gray face. "I have a headache," Sarah confessed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Every shift. The moment I walk into the Heritage Wing, it starts. A pounding right behind my eyes, and the nausea." "My father didn't have these symptoms before he moved here," Eleanor pressed. "Thorne says it's his heart, but Barnaby keeps alerting to this wall. He smells something." Sarah stepped closer to the bed. "We've had other cases," she admitted, her eyes darting to the door again. 3 other patients in this corridor. Respiratory failure, rapid decline. The administration said it was a viral cluster. They isolated them." "Did they make it?" Eleanor asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Sarah shook her head slowly. "No." The silence in the room became suffocating. The beep-beep of the monitor seemed to grow louder, faster. "We need to see what's behind that wall," Eleanor said, a newfound determination hardening her voice. "Thorne said this wing was renovated last month. My dad was a carpenter. He taught me that when you rush a job, you bury your mistakes." "We can't," Sarah hissed. "If we damage the room, Thorne will fire me. He'll have you arrested for destruction of property. The board members are coming tomorrow morning for the ribbon cutting. Everything has to be perfect." "My father is dying, Sarah," Eleanor's voice cracked, tears finally spilling over. "I don't care about their ribbon cutting. I care about the poison they locked my father in with." Barnaby let out a sharp bark, then another. He began to scratch frantically at the electrical outlet again, his claws tearing through the thin layer of new paint. "He's trying to get at it," Eleanor said. She looked around the room. Her eyes landed on her father's bedside drawer. She yanked it open. Inside, among the tissues and reading glasses, was a small metal nail file. It wasn't a crowbar, it wasn't a hammer, but it was metal. "Eleanor, wait," Sarah pleaded, though she didn't move to stop her. "If you do this—" "If I don't, he dies tonight," Eleanor said. She knelt down by the outlet. Barnaby stepped back, giving her space but watching intently. Eleanor jammed the tip of the nail file behind the plastic faceplate of the outlet. Snap! The plastic cover popped off, clattering onto the laminate floor. A puff of air hissed out from the gap around the electrical box. It wasn't just a draft. It was a concentrated stream of that sickly, sweet chemical smell. Sarah coughed, covering her nose and mouth with her arm. "Oh, God," she gagged. "That's strong." Eleanor shone the flashlight from her phone into the small gap between the drywall and the electrical box. At first, she saw nothing but darkness and insulation. But then, as she angled the light downward, she saw it. The insulation wasn't the fluffy pink fiberglass it was supposed to be. It was wet. It was black. And it was moving. A thick, dark sludge was oozing down the inner framing of the wall, coating the wires, soaking into the wood. And growing on that sludge was a fuzzy, gray mold that seemed to pulsate in the beam of the light. "It's not just a leak," Eleanor whispered, recoiling from the smell. "The whole wall, it's rotting from the inside out." She looked up at Sarah, her face pale. "This is toxic black mold," Eleanor said, the terminology from her father's old safety manuals coming back to her. "But it's mixed with something else, something chemical, solvent. They sealed the walls before the framing was dry, and they used industrial adhesives to rush the job." They created an incubator, Sarah realized, horror dawning in her eyes. "And the ventilation system is pumping the spores right into my father's lungs," Eleanor finished. Just then, the cardiac monitor let out a long, piercing alarm. "Beep!" "Code blue!" Sarah shouted, her instincts taking over. She dove for the emergency button on the wall. "His heart stopped! Eleanor, move!" As nurses rushed into the room and the crash cart was wheeled in, Eleanor was shoved into the corner. She grabbed Barnaby's collar, burying her face in his fur as she watched them perform CPR on her father. And in the chaos, amidst the shouting and the compressions, she saw Dr. Thorne standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking at the patient. He wasn't looking at the nurses saving a life. He was looking at the removed outlet cover on the floor. And the look on his face wasn't concern. It was fury. "Clear!" The jolt of the defibrillator made Arthur's frail body arch off the mattress. Eleanor pressed her knuckles against her mouth to stifle a scream, her other hand gripping Barnaby's fur so tight her fingers went white. The dog didn't bark. He stood like a stone sentinel, his eyes fixed on the man in the bed, his low whine lost beneath the mechanical chaos of the crash cart. "No pulse!" Sarah shouted, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Charging to 200! Clear!" Thump. Silence. Then a single weak beep. Then another. The monitor stumbled back into a jagged, uneven rhythm. "We have a rhythm," Sarah exhaled, wiping sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. "Sinus tachycardia. He's back, but he's barely hanging on." Dr. Thorne stepped into the room fully now. He didn't look relieved. He looked like a man calculating the cost of a liability. "Stabilize him for transport," Thorne ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. "Move him to the intensive care unit in the North Block." "The North Block?" Sarah questioned, looking up from the IV line she was adjusting. "That's the old wing. The equipment there is outdated. We should keep him here where—" "I said the North Block," Thorne snapped. "This room is compromised, clearly." His eyes snapped to Eleanor, then down to the exposed outlet where the black sludge was visibly bubbling in the sudden heat of the room. "You," Thorne hissed, stepping over the cables to loom over Eleanor. "You vandalized hospital property. You tampered with the electrical systems while your father was in cardiac arrest." "I found the leak," Eleanor said, standing up. Her legs were shaking, but her anger was a solid, burning thing in her chest. "Look at it! The walls are bleeding poison, Doctor!" "That's what killed his heart." Thorne kicked the plastic outlet cover across the room. "That is condensation. he lied smoothly, though his nostrils flared as the chemical stench hit him. And you have just exposed a sterile environment to contaminants from the substructure. If your father dies tonight, Miss Vance, it will be because you decided to play construction worker instead of letting medical professionals do their job. He pulled a radio from his belt. Security to room 402. Immediate extraction. We have a hostile visitor. You can't kick me out, Eleanor argued, backing toward the wall. He needs me. He needs a doctor, Thorne sneered. And he needs to be away from this biohazard of a dog. Barnaby stepped forward. He didn't growl this time. He just stood between Eleanor and Thorne, an 80-pound barrier of golden fur and muscle. He looked Thorne dead in the eye, his posture unyielding. Thorne flinched. He took a step back, straightening his tie. "Get the patient out!" Thorne barked at the team of nurses. "Now!" As they began to unlock the wheels of the bed, Eleanor realized she had seconds. Once they moved Arthur, Thorne would seal this room. He would paint over the mold, fix the outlet, and bury the truth just like he buried the other patients Sarah had mentioned. She would be banned from the hospital, and her father would die alone in the North Block. Another unexplained statistic. She needed proof. "I love you, Dad," she whispered to the unconscious figure as they rolled the bed past her. Then, as the nurses maneuvered the heavy bed through the door, blocking Thorne's view for a split second, Eleanor dropped to her knees. She grabbed a discarded gauze pad from the floor, one that had fallen during the resuscitation. She jammed her fingers into the hole in the wall. The sludge was cold and slimy. It burned her skin slightly on contact. She smeared a thick, black glob of the toxic mixture onto the gauze, then shoved the wet, reeking fabric deep into the pocket of her jeans. "Hey!" Thorne shouted, seeing her movement as the bed cleared the doorway. "What are you doing?" Two security guards appeared in the hallway, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. "Grab her," Thorne ordered, pointing a shaking finger at Eleanor. "Check her pockets. She's trying to steal property." "Barnaby, run!" Eleanor shouted. She didn't wait for the guards to enter. She grabbed the leash and bolted, not toward the door where the guards were blocking the exit, but toward the bathroom connected to the suite. "Get her!" Eleanor slammed the bathroom door and locked it. It was a flimsy lock, designed for privacy, not security. Bang! The guards hit the door from the outside. The wood splintered. "There's no way out, lady," a guard yelled. Eleanor looked around frantically. A sink, a toilet, a shower. No window. "Damn it," she cried, tears streaming down her face. She could hear them preparing to kick the door in. She had the evidence in her pocket, but she was trapped. Then she saw it. The ventilation grate above the toilet. It was the same new, shiny metal as the one in the bedroom. Barnaby jumped into the bathtub and barked at the grate. He knew. Eleanor climbed onto the toilet seat. She pulled a coin from her pocket, a quarter, and used it to unscrew the two simple screws holding the grate in place. Her hands were trembling so hard, she dropped the coin twice. Crack! The bathroom door frame gave way. A black boot kicked through the wood. "One more kick!" the guard shouted. The grate clattered into the bathtub. Eleanor looked into the duct. It was tight, dusty, and smelled overwhelmingly of that sweet, rotting almond scent. "Up, Barnaby!" she commanded, patting the edge of the duct. The dog didn't hesitate. He scrambled up onto the toilet tank, then leaped, his front paws hooking onto the metal lip of the vent. Eleanor shoved him from behind, pushing his heavy hindquarters until he shimmied into the darkness of the crawl space. The bathroom door flew open. Two large guards burst in, batons drawn. Eleanor was halfway into the vent, her legs kicking in the air as she dragged herself into the cramped metal tunnel. "Grab her legs!" Thorne's voice screamed from the bedroom. A hand clamped around Eleanor's ankle. "No!" she screamed, kicking out blindly. Her sneaker connected with something hard, a face mask or a nose. The grip loosened. She pulled herself forward, scraping her elbows raw on the galvanized steel, crawling deeper into the dark belly of the hospital. She turned back just in time to see the great opening recede into the shadows. She was in the walls now. "Go, Barnaby," she whispered into the dark, the sound of her own breathing echoing loudly in the metal tube. "Find the exit." Ahead of her, she heard the clicking of claws on metal and a soft woof. They were moving parallel to the main hallway. Through the thin aluminum of the ducts, she could hear the muffled sounds of the hospital below. But as they crawled further, away from her father's room, she heard something else. It wasn't mechanical. It was a voice. Coming from a vent a few yards ahead. "Told you the mixture was unstable," a man's voice argued. It sounded like Thorne. "We saved 40% on the insulation costs. The board doesn't need to know about the side effects." "The mold is eating the wiring, Lawrence," another voice replied. A woman's voice, sharp and terrified. "It's not just the patients. The building is sick. If the fire inspector sees the sub-basement—" Eleanor froze. She fumbled for her phone in her pocket, her fingers brushing against the toxic gauze. She hit record. The metal beneath Eleanor's elbows was freezing, but the air blowing into her face was hot and thick with that sickening, sweet stench. She held her phone steady, the red recording timer ticking upward. 43, 44. Below her, through the slats of the executive office vent, Dr. Thorne was pacing. From this angle, she could only see the top of his pristine white coat and the frantic movements of his hands. "You don't understand, Mallory," Thorne's voice filtered up, distorted by the tin echo, but clear enough to ruin him. "The structural dampness isn't just in the walls, it's in the foundation. The sealant failed 3 months ago. The heritage wing is basically sitting on a sponge soaked in industrial solvent and mold." "Then we evacuate," the woman Mallory replied. Eleanor recognized the voice. It was Mallory Kincaid, the hospital's chief financial officer. "We shut it down, Lawrence. We can't let the board see this tomorrow." "And lose the $20 million grant?" Thorne slammed his hand on a desk. Bang! Eleanor flinched, her phone slipping an inch on the metal surface. "No, we patch it. We paint it. We sedate the patients who complain about the headaches. Just get me through the ceremony tomorrow. After the check clears, we can discover a maintenance issue and close for repairs." "And Arthur Vance?" Mallory asked, her voice quieter. "He's dying, Lawrence. His daughter knows." "The old man won't survive the night in the North Block," Thorne said dismissively. "His heart is already failing. Once he's gone, the daughter has no standing. We cremate him quickly. No autopsy. No evidence of the toxins in his system." Eleanor felt a cold rage settle in her stomach, heavier than the fear. They weren't just negligent. They were executioners. Beside her, Barnaby shifted. The cramped space was terrifying for him. His claws scrabbled against the sheet metal, creating a sharp scratch sound that echoed through the ductwork. Below, silence fell instantly. "What was that?" Thorne asked. Eleanor froze, holding her breath until her lungs burned. "Rats," Mallory suggested nervously. "The building is old." "Rats don't sound like that," Thorne said. Eleanor saw his shadow move directly under the vent. He looked up. She jerked her head back into the darkness, just as a beam of light from a desk lamp sliced through the grate, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the toxic air. "Security!" Thorne yelled, his voice no longer muffled, but projecting directly into the ventilation shaft. "They're in the vents above the administration office! Seal the building! Cut the power to the HVAC fans!" "Go, Barnaby," Eleanor whispered urgently, shoving the dog's rear end. "Go, go, go!" They scrambled forward. The crawl was a nightmare. The duct took a sharp turn, narrowing until Eleanor's shoulders brushed the sides. The darkness was absolute now, broken only by the dim light of her phone screen. Suddenly, a loud clang reverberated through the metal tunnel. Then a whoosh. The fans stopped. The constant hum of air that had masked their movements died, leaving a terrifying silence. Now, every movement they made, every scrape of denim, every click of a dog's nail rang out like a gunshot. "I can hear them!" a voice shouted from below, muffled by ceiling tiles. "Section 4! Above the hallway!" Something heavy slammed into the duct from underneath. A baton? A broom handle? The thin metal sheet buckled upward, hitting Eleanor in the knee. She cried out, biting her lip to stifle the sound. "Faster, Barnaby," she pleaded. The dog was panting heavily, the bad air clearly affecting him. He stopped at a junction where the duct split into 3 directions. Left, right, down. Eleanor shone her light. Left seemed to head toward the lobby. Too public, too many guards. Right went back toward the wards, but Barnaby ignored both. He lowered his head into the vertical shaft going down a square, dark throat that plunged into the depths of the building. He whined and looked at Eleanor, then dipped his nose into the shaft. "Down?" Eleanor whispered. "That goes to the basement." Barnaby barked once, soft, muffled, and then, with a courage that shamed her, he slid his front paws over the edge and let gravity take him. Eleanor heard the sound of his claws sliding against metal, a terrifying slide, followed by a soft thud and a splash. A splash? The guards were banging on the ceiling tiles just a few yards behind her. She could hear the tiles crumbling. Eleanor put her phone in her mouth, grabbed the edge of the shaft, and jumped. It was a controlled fall, sliding against the sides to slow her descent, but she still landed hard. She hit wet concrete, her legs buckling. She gasped, dropping her phone. The flashlight spun, illuminating the room they had fallen into. It was the sub-basement, the place Thorne had mentioned. It wasn't a room. It was a swamp. They were standing in 3 inches of stagnant black water. The room was massive, filled with the hum of giant rusted boilers and a maze of pipes. But the walls... Eleanor retrieved her phone and shone the light around. The walls were alive. The entire foundation of the Heritage Wing was covered in a thick, pulsating carpet of black mold. It looked like alien ivy, strangling the concrete, dripping slime into the water they were standing in. And in the center of the room, a massive pipe labeled Main Air Intake, Heritage Wing, had a rupture in its side. The pipe wasn't pulling fresh air from outside. The rupture was sucking the mold spores, the evaporating chemical fumes from the water, and the rot directly from this dungeon and pumping it upstairs. Pumping it into the lungs of every patient. Into her father. "Oh my God," Eleanor whispered, covering her nose with her shirt. "It's a gas chamber." Barnaby was wading through the black water, sniffing at the rupture. He looked back at her, his golden fur now stained with muck, and gave a low, urgent woof. He had found the source. But before Eleanor could take a photo, The heavy steel door at the far end of the boiler room groaned. The wheel handle on the outside was turning. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Someone was coming in, and there was no other way out. Eleanor looked around frantically. There was nowhere to hide except behind the massive, rusted boiler tank itself, deep in the shadows where the mold was thickest. "Get behind me," she whispered to Barnaby, dragging him into the dark corner just as the door swung open. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. "I know you're down here," Dr. Thorne's voice echoed off the damp walls. He wasn't shouting anymore. He sounded calm. Dangerous. He stepped into the water, and in his hand, Eleanor saw the glint of a surgical scalpel. "Come out, Ms. Vance," he said softly. "Let's discuss your father's prognosis." The water in the sub-basement rippled as Dr. Thorne stepped closer, the scalpel in his hand catching the beam of his flashlight. "You really should have left when I asked," Thorne said, his voice echoing off the dripping pipes. "Now I'm afraid you've become a liability. A contaminated intruder in a restricted area. Accidents happen in these old basements all the time." Eleanor backed away until her spine pressed against the cold, slime-covered tank of the boiler. There was nowhere left to go. The water soaked through her jeans, chilling her to the bone, but the fear was colder. "You're killing them," Eleanor said, her hand tightening around the heavy brass valve behind her back. "My father. The others." "You're poisoning them for a grant." "I'm saving this hospital," Thorne snapped, his calm facade cracking for a second. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to run this place? We needed that money. If a few geriatric patients with pre-existing conditions pass away a few months early, it is a necessary sacrifice for the greater good." He lunged. It was a fast, vicious movement, aimed not at Eleanor, but at the dog. Thorne knew Barnaby was the only thing standing between him and Eleanor. He slashed the scalpel in a wide arc. "Barnaby, strike!" Eleanor screamed. The golden retriever didn't hesitate. He didn't bite. He launched his 80-pound body like a missile, slamming squarely into Thorne's chest. The impact was brutal. Thorne gasped as the air left his lungs. He flew backward, splashing heavily into the stagnant black water. The flashlight flew from his hand, spinning through the air before sinking into the muck, casting erratic, underwater shadows across the mold-infested walls. "Run!" Eleanor yelled. She didn't wait to see if Thorne resurfaced. She grabbed Barnaby's collar and scrambled toward a rusty iron ladder at the far end of the room, the emergency maintenance exit she had spotted in the swinging light. They splashed through the filth, slipping on the slime-coated concrete. Behind them, a roar of rage erupted from the water. Thorne broke the surface, coughing up sludge, thrashing as he tried to find his footing. "Security! Sub-basement!" Thorne screamed into his wet radio. "Shoot the dog! Shoot to kill!" Eleanor hit the ladder. The rungs were rusted and slick. She hauled herself up, Barnaby scrambling up the steep metal stairs beside the ladder, his claws sparking against the iron. "Come on, come on," she chanted, her breath hitching. Below, Thorne was wading toward them, abandoning stealth for pure fury. Eleanor reached the top platform and threw her weight against the trapdoor. It stuck. Years of paint and wax from the floor above had sealed it. "Open!" she grunted, slamming her shoulder into it. From below, Thorne grabbed the bottom of the ladder. The metal frame shuddered. "There is nowhere to go, Eleanor," he shouted, starting to climb. Barnaby stopped at the top of the stairs. He looked down at the approaching doctor. He didn't bark. He simply bared his teeth and let out a growl that sounded like a tectonic plate shifting. Then he shook his wet coat violently, sending a spray of toxic, black sludge raining down onto Thorne's upturned face. Thorne shrieked, rubbing his eyes as the chemical water burned them. He slipped, falling back into the water with a heavy splash. Eleanor gave one final, desperate shove. Crack! The trap door flew open. Bright, sterile light flooded the dark shaft. Eleanor scrambled out, pulling Barnaby up behind her. They spilled out onto the polished marble floor of the main lobby. It was surreal. One second, they were in a dungeon of rot and poison. The next, they were surrounded by bouquets of white lilies and a banner that read, "Grand Opening, a new era of care." The night receptionist, a young man with headphones around his neck, dropped his coffee cup. He stared in horror at the woman and dog covered in black slime, smelling of death and almonds, standing in the center of the pristine atrium. "Call the police!" Eleanor screamed at him, her voice raw. "Not security, the police!" "Stop her!" Thorne's voice echoed from the trap door, sounding distant but approaching fast. Eleanor didn't wait. She grabbed Barnaby and sprinted. Not toward the exit, she couldn't leave her father. She ran toward the North Block elevators. Her sneakers squeaked on the marble, leaving a trail of black footprints that marred the perfection of the lobby. Alarms began to blare, a lockdown signal triggered by Thorne. "The elevators are shut down," Eleanor realized as the panel went dark. "Stairs!" They burst into the stairwell just as two security guards rounded the corner of the lobby. "Halt!" one yelled, reaching for his taser. Barnaby snarled, snapping at the air, keeping them back just long enough for Eleanor to slam the fire door shut and jam the nail file, still in her pocket, into the push-bar mechanism. They ran up 4 flights of stairs. Eleanor's lungs were burning, her legs heavy as lead. 4th floor, North Block. She kicked the door open. This wing was silent. It was the old part of the hospital. Dim lighting, scuffed floors, smelling of old dust instead of lemon. "Room 412, she whispered, remembering where Sarah said they moved critical patients. She ran down the hall, checking numbers. 408, 410, 412. The door was closed. Eleanor burst in. The room was dark. A single monitor beeped slowly. Beep! Beep! Arthur lay in the bed, looking smaller than ever. But he was alone. No nurse, no doctor. Just a dying man in a storage room disguised as a ward. "Dad!" Eleanor sobbed, rushing to his side. She checked his breathing. It was faint, barely there. "He's crashing again," she realized. "They moved him here to die." Barnaby jumped onto the bed, something he was never allowed to do. He curled his wet, dirty body around Arthur's legs, resting his head on Arthur's chest. He wasn't comforting him, he was grounding him. Suddenly, the heavy thud of boots sounded in the hallway. "Room 412! Break it down!" Thorne's voice was hysterical now. Eleanor looked around. There was no other exit. She was cornered. She pulled out her phone. The recording. She needed to broadcast it. But to who? The police would take too long. Her eyes landed on the hospital's PA system panel on the wall near the nurse's call button. It was an old model with a microphone jack for local announcements. She didn't have a microphone. But she had her phone, and she had the auxiliary cord she used in her car, tangled in her pocket. Bang! The door shuddered as a shoulder hit it. "Open this door, Miss Vance!" Thorne screamed. "It's over!" Eleanor jammed one end of the cord into the wall port and the other into her phone, using the dongle she prayed still worked after the moisture. She turned the volume on her phone to maximum. She hit play. "Barnaby," she whispered, grabbing a heavy IV pole and standing in front of the door. "Hold the line." The door flew open. Thorne stood there, wet, filthy, his eyes wild, flanked by 3 guards. "Get that phone!" Thorne roared, lunging forward. But before he could take a step, his own voice boomed out of every speaker in the hospital, in the lobby, in the waiting rooms, in the nurses' stations, and right there in the hallway. The structural dampness isn't just in the walls. The Heritage Wing is basically sitting on a sponge soaked in industrial solvent and mold. Thorne froze. The guards froze. "We patch it. We paint it. Just get me through the ceremony tomorrow." The recording echoed through the corridors like the voice of God. Down the hall, doors began to open. Nurses, patients, and families stepped out, confused, listening to the confession of their medical director ringing from the ceiling. Thorne looked up at the speaker, his face draining of color. Then he looked at Eleanor, who was holding the IV pole like a spear, and the dirty golden retriever standing on the bed, growling with the ferocity of a wolf. "It's not over," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but loud. "It's just started." The recording cut off with a sharp, static click, leaving a ringing silence in the corridor of the North Block. For 3 seconds, no one moved. The confession. "The mold is eating the wiring. We sedate the patients, seem to hang in the air like smoke." Dr. Thorne stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, water dripping from his ruined suit onto the linoleum. The mask of the polished, efficient administrator was gone. In its place was a desperate, cornered animal. "It's a deep fake," Thorne stammered, his voice rising to a shrill pitch. He pointed a trembling finger at Eleanor. "She used AI. She manipulated the audio. Arrest her!" He turned to the security guards, expecting blind obedience. "I gave you an order," Thorne screamed. "Seize the phone!" The senior guard, a man named Miller who had worked at the hospital for 15 years, looked at the wet, shivering doctor. Then he looked at the IV pole in Eleanor's shaking hands and the dog standing guard on the dying man's bed. Miller reached down to his belt, but he didn't pull his baton. He unclipped his radio. "Central," Miller said, his eyes never leaving Thorne's face. "We have a code gray in the North Block. And request police presence immediately." "What are you doing?" Thorne lunged, trying to grab the radio. Barnaby roared. It wasn't a warning bark this time. It was a thunderous sound that shook the small room. The golden retriever leaped from the bed, landing squarely between Miller and Thorne, his teeth bared, his hackles raised in a ridge of golden fury. Thorne stumbled back, tripping over his own wet shoes. He hit the wall hard, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, defeated not by a weapon, but by the truth he had tried to bury in concrete. "It's over, Lawrence." The voice came from the hallway. Mallory Kincaid, the CFO whose terrified voice had been on the recording, stood there. She was pale, clutching her tablet like a shield. Behind her stood Sarah, the night nurse, and 2 police officers who had been patrolling the emergency room entrance. "I told you we couldn't hide it," Mallory whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I told you the building was sick." "You!" Thorne sneered, but the fight had left him. The police officers stepped forward, handcuffs clicking metallically in the quiet room. As they pulled Thorne to his feet and read him his rights, he didn't look at the officers. He looked at the dog. Barnaby watched him go, his tail giving a single, slow wag of dismissal. "We need a transfer team," Sarah shouted, finally rushing into the room. She ignored the police and went straight to Arthur. "Get a crash cart for transport. We are moving him to St. Jude's across town. Get him out of this air." Eleanor dropped the IV pole. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the floor beside the bed. Barnaby was there instantly. He licked the tears from her face, his heavy paws resting on her shoulders, his warm breath smelling of life, not almonds. "We did it, boy," Eleanor sobbed, burying her face in his wet, dirty fur. "We did it." 6 weeks later. The autumn sun was warm, filtering through the turning leaves of the oak tree in Eleanor's backyard. Arthur sat in his wheelchair on the new wooden deck, a thick plaid blanket tucked around his legs. He was thinner, his face etched with new lines, but the gray, waxy pallor of death was gone. His cheeks were pink, and his eyes were clear. "Hand me that sandpaper, Ellie," he rasped. His voice was still gravelly. The doctor said his lungs would never be 100% again, but it was strong. Eleanor smiled, handing him the square of grit. He was sanding a small block of cedar, refusing to let his hands go idle, even in recovery. "You know," Arthur said, looking out at the yard, "the lawyers said the settlement from Heritage Hall is going to be big. Thorne is looking at 20 years for criminal negligence and fraud." "I don't care about the money, Dad," Eleanor said, sipping her tea. "I just care that they closed that wing before anyone else died." "We care about one other thing," Arthur corrected. He whistled, a low, sharp sound. Barnaby came trotting around the corner of the house. He was no longer the muddy, desperate creature from the sub-basement. His coat was groomed and gleaming like spun gold. Around his neck, hanging from his collar, was a new metal-a shiny brass tag that read, "Hero." But Barnaby didn't care about the metal. He cared about the tennis ball in his mouth. He walked up to the wheelchair and dropped the ball gently in Arthur's lap. "You saved my life, you stubborn mule," Arthur whispered, scratching the dog behind the ear, the sweet spot that made Barnaby's leg kick. Barnaby leaned his head against Arthur's chest, closing his eyes. He let out a long, contented sigh. He didn't need to bark. He didn't need to scratch at the walls. The air was clean. The house was safe. And his pack was together. Eleanor watched them, realizing that sometimes the loudest warnings come from the quietest souls. You just have to be willing to listen.